Welcome to the Serve Campus podcast, a resource for campus ministry workers and volunteers across Canada, providing inspiration, education, and coaching for people leading ministries on post-secondary campuses. Our goal is to encourage and resource you in your vital work on universities, colleges, institutes, wherever you are. Grab a cup of coffee, enjoy the show. And John Ingalls is interviewing Andy Steiger today. It's going to be a good one, so just relax and have a good time.
Everybody, and welcome to our podcast today. I hope that our time together really helps you think more creatively about serving and enriching your campus ministry among students, staff, and everyone on post-secondary campuses. And our question for those who are listening is how can we help you better engage your campus? And so we hope that this podcast can help answer that question in some meaningful ways for you today. Well, we're excited to have Andy Steiger with us to talk about all things apologetics. Think you can do that in 30 minutes, Andy?
I can do it. I'll give it a try.
Andy, it's so great to have you with us, and I've really appreciated our relationship interactions over the years and the many times that you have been able to go on campuses here in British Columbia, and I know it goes beyond that as well. Far beyond that. But Andy is the founder and president of Apologetics Canada out in Abbotsford, BC. And it's an organization dedicated to helping the church better engage culture through discipleship. And again, thanks so much for being with us today in a very wet British Columbia.
Yes, it's a wet and now snowy British Columbia. As though the flooding wasn't enough, now we got snow.
Yeah, and how has it been out there, Andy? You live right in the middle of the midst of the flood, and you've had helicopters over your head all the time, and things have abated a little bit in terms of water. But what's it looking like right now?
Yeah, things are slowly getting back to normal. We're still on like gas rations, and there's still plenty of helicopters, and the military is still here helping, because at the moment the water's starting to recede, and it's receding enough that we can now use highways again, which is nice, but it's now in the process of really people dealing with the destruction. I actually had somebody over at my house yesterday that was flooded, and just hearing about how bad it is, it really was devastating for many people. This water too, I mean, it has oil in it, it's got diesel in it, it's got dead animals in it, it's got, it's like, this isn't just like water. This is very contaminated water that is in people's homes, it's in people's barns, businesses, and the like. So you can imagine the cleanup's gonna take a while, and it's gonna be challenging.
Yeah, wow, that's a whole nother world. It really is. And I mean, the whole infrastructure and the length of time it's going to take just to recover from all this, and not to mention the economic impact of it all. It's far-reaching. Well, yeah.
Well, it's interesting on that note, John. I was talking with some MPs recently, and I was just sharing with them. Particularly, I was talking with Ed Fast. I was just saying, Ed, I could see this. I think this is going to be the worst natural disaster, infrastructure-wise, that Canada has had to deal with. Period. And the MPs I've talked with, they're like, yeah, that it's that bad. So as Canadians are listening to this and they're trying to wrap their minds around it, I mean, that's the level of devastation that we're dealing with here. So please keep us in your prayers, as out here in BC as we deal with yet another disaster. And also, this is kind of interesting as well, John, not to belabor this, but we dealt with heat dome as well here in BC in the summer, as you remember. And that also was quite devastating. So it's been a double punch. So please keep us in your prayers. But on a different note, it is good to be with you. And thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm looking forward to talking about other things other than COVID or flooding let's talk about apologetics.
Yeah, and it's kind of unavoidable in almost every conversation, isn't it? But
Yeah.
yeah, well, let's switch to you now a bit and tell us about yourself and just your journey and coming to know Christ.
Yeah, I'm an American. I grew up I was born in California, raised in Portland, Oregon, and heard about this land up north where they had their own currency. And I really was one of those Americans. I thought Canada was a part of the US nobody talked about. And then I heard that they had their own money and it wasn't worth as much as ours, and I could go to college there for less. And now this place sounded great. So I packed my car, headed north. This is a story. I pull off Bellingham. For those of you on the West Coast, you'll know that that's about 30 minutes from the border. But I was so naive. I thought I had a day's journey ahead of me to get to this, northern country of Canada. And so I pull off and get a hotel, and then, the next day, 30 minutes later, I'm at the border. I was so upset that I wasted all that money on a hotel when I was that close. And you'd think, man, you should have seen the signs, right? Like Canada, but I didn't. Came here, went to college, met my wife. I've been here ever since. I've now lived in Canada longer than I lived in the U.S. So I'm in a bit of an identity crisis these days. I'm more Canadian than American for sure.
Now, does that mean that you have dual citizenship, or are you one or the other?
Right. So I'm currently permanent resident that's working towards citizenship. Yeah. Okay. And that's kind of a long story in itself. When I first came here, for many years, I didn't think that I would stay here. My wife and I anticipated being missionaries. And we even, moved down to Los Angeles to do a master's degree. I have 2 kids, by the way. And we just had our second child, William. And we moved there to finish a master's degree with every intention of going off into missions. And, this really circles back on our story as we began to hear about the number of young people that were leaving the church, both in the United States and Canada, and really felt God calling us back to Canada as missionaries. We had already pastored for many years at that point. But as we went back, we went back to Canada to start this organization, Apologetics Canada, to help address issues that young people were raising, and really to help the church in the area of discipleship.
I can just imagine your story. I'm from Bellingham, and so I get the border thing totally. So I was just,
you realize how ridiculous
I was trying not to laugh too hard, but yeah. Anyway, so thank you for sharing with us about your history, and I'm glad you're on the track for citizenship. My wife and I and 2 younger kids actually became citizens in June, and so it took us many years to go from permanent residence to citizenship. I won't get into that, but
it's a journey.
It is. Yeah. So you mentioned launching Apologetics Canada. What was behind that? Like, what really kind of led you to do that?
When I first heard about apologetics, first of all, again, okay, I've pastored, in total, I've pastored now for 20 years. At that point, I had pastored for like 9 years sort of thing. But I'd pastored. I had this desire to be a missionary. I didn't know what apologetics was, but I'm in Los Angeles doing my master's, and I hear about this thing that sounds like apologizing, right? And so you're kind of going, well, what is this? And I learned, that it's this Greek word, apologia, which means to give an answer or a reason. Intriguingly enough, fun fact, in Greece, they still use the same word today. And it has more or less the same meaning. It's used in a court of law. If you're defending yourself, if you're giving a reason for your actions, if you will, that's an apologetic. And so really, as the Apostle Paul and as the Apostle Peter in particular in 1 Peter 3:15, he's telling Christians, hey, you should be able to give a reason. In fact, Peter says you should be able to give a good reason for why you've placed your trust in Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say in 1 Peter 3:15, and 16, to do so with gentleness and respect. So that's that idea of apologetics. But what I find interesting about apologetics, or this idea of giving a good reason, is a lot of people think about it evangelistically, like giving a good reason to a friend or family member or whatever why they should place their trust in Jesus. But that wasn't how I approached it at the beginning. I approached it more from the standpoint of what good reason do I have, and what good reason am I sharing with myself why I should continue to follow Jesus, why I'm putting my trust and my hope in Jesus. Because that's where I think discipleship and evangelism starts with, do you personally have a good reason? And then secondly, are you able and willing to share that good reason with other people?
Yeah, boy, that says a lot of it right there. Just a really good summary of what apologetics is about. Well, as we dive into this subject and immerse ourselves in this a bit, would you be able to unpack this moment in history that we're experiencing right now in Canada and maybe North America? Could you unpack that for us, and how is that being addressed as you go to campuses and talk among students? What are you finding?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about for a number of years. After I did my master's degree, I went on to do my PhD at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And a lot of my doctoral work, involved looking at where we are currently in our culture, our historical moment, if you will, and how do we get here? And I think that there's a variety of different ways we could approach the question you're asking. I mean, it's a big question, and I think there's different avenues that we could take to get there, or what we focus on. But here's the way I look at it, at least, about the historical moment we're in and how we got here. I think that we've been on a journey culturally for a while that I think started with the Enlightenment. And I think maybe one of the best ways to put it is in kind of three categories of what is an authoritative statement, I think is an important question, and kind of helps frame this. Because I would argue that before the Enlightenment, so we're talking like the 1500s here, right? Before the Enlightenment, I think an authoritative statement was a theological statement. And then we went into this Enlightenment project where science really began to develop and led into this scientific revolution, which by and large, I mean, there were many Christians that were involved in this endeavor, like Descartes and others. And I say that because, we tend to want to bifurcate history and say, oh, like there was these, Christians, and then there were these scientists. And it's like, no. When you go look and read these, primary sources, it's not so like, we want to divide things so neatly. And it's like, no, history's messy. They were both Christians and scientists, and they were exploring the world. They were trying to figure out how things worked. Including how do bodies work. It's actually fascinating to read Descartes and about how he thinks the body works. So about, for example, he thought that the heart was like a furnace. He didn't really understand that it was pumping blood. He knew that it was happening, but he thought it was happening because the heart was like this furnace kind of idea. And there's other things, and we kind of balk at that now. We laugh, oh man, it's so, they're so ignorant or whatever. It's like, but they were in the trying to figure it out phase, right? But as we were trying to figure things out, we went from theology being an authoritative statement to science being an authoritative statement. And that's really framed a lot of the way that we do life, is looking at things through this scientific worldview. However, I would argue that, John, we're in this like shift where science has really lost its authority in our culture. And I would say that happened during World War II, because so much of the destruction that happens in World War II happens in the name of science and in the name of progress. And people look back on World War II and World War I and these horrific events and saw that, hey, like, maybe science shouldn't be this authoritative statement, because we can see that science can lead to really destructive things. And you see this shift that begins to occur after World War II, and particularly you see this with the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, where this new authoritative statement becomes a legal statement. And now we swim in the waters of human rights of various sorts. And I think that really frames the world that we're living in right now, where there is this constant battle for power, and we're seeing that shift of power becoming more and more into the legal realm. And not surprisingly, then things like the Supreme Court or politics have taken on more of a significant role in our lives, because we realize how much power can be had there when they're making the laws. I don't know, does that make sense, John?
Yeah, it does. And the mantra that keeps kind of running through my head here as you're talking, and then I'm thinking of how to connect these dots, is the words that were used in the last political cycle and continue to be in the pandemic is follow the science. So yeah, there's like this reversion back to this authoritative thing that you're talking about. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Because
okay.
I was actually going to bring that up, because you're hearing that being touted. And notice, it's kind of like old guard, right? It's like they're trying to say, hey, but follow the science. It's like, yeah, but at the end of the day, are you really about the science? Because it seems to be that you're just about the laws. And I would say that what you're witnessing there is the power struggle between those two, where some people still want to use this idea of science has led us here, but others are like, no, we're just going to make these laws. And it really doesn't depend upon the science.
That's really interesting. It is an important moment that we're in, right? And like you said, it's a bit of a seesaw right now.
It is.
Yeah.
And by the way, when I'm saying this, I hope just listeners, please appreciate that I'm not saying this disparagingly of science or law. I'm just noting that this is where we're at as a society, as we're trying to figure these things out.
Right. And with that idea, I guess, with science and rationality, where do you see spirituality now in this generation? Like, what's that looking like?
Well, I think this becomes really interesting. And I've been thinking about this lately, because I said that we went from from an authoritative statement being a theological statement to this scientific statement, and now we're into this legal statement. And oddly enough, what begins to happen as you make this progression is you circle back to theology. Because now when you start to make an authoritative statement a legal statement, you have to ask, well, who's the legal authority? And this becomes an interesting question in our time. Like when you, for example, get out of World War II and you look at like this UN Declaration of Human Rights that ultimately leads into these trials. You have the Nuremberg trials and you have the Tokyo trials, and they want to take, it's this social justice moment, which, by the way, social justice isn't a new thing. In my pre-World War II readings, social justice is brought up often in the literature. So don't think social justice is new. Like this has been building to, a legal statement becoming an authoritative statement just didn't happen overnight. Like we've been building into this moment where we're leading into this social justice, mantra, where notice though, so if we just take these Nuremberg and Tokyo trials as an example, they have to appeal to an authority that can hold people like Nazi Germany to account, which ultimately they appeal to this, what's called a suprapositive So a law above the law sort of idea. In other words, there's a law that governs people, but there's a law that governs governments sort of idea. And now we have to ask, well, what is this law? Like, at the end of the day, is morality a human invention? Is it, in other words, is morality invented, or is it discovered? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, does it already exist, or are we creating it? And what I find fascinating, and I've been seeing this happen in academics, in the academy, there is more and more of a movement that morality is discovered, not invented. And this is referred to as objective moral values. These, by that meaning that they're moral values that are true outside of your opinion. It comes back, though, to this question of, well, who says? How do we determine that? And where I find this becomes interesting is notice that we started talking about law, but we've quickly started moving into this thing that takes us into spirituality, right? As we're talking about, well, who is this lawgiver? And what I find happens in the academy is people get really nervous to start talking like that, because that starts sounding like religion. That starts sounding like spirituality and God. So what they call this is they'll just say, oh, this is just a fact of the universe. This is just a fact. This is just the way that it is. But they don't want to dig any deeper. However, what I'm finding, though, is there's a number of students and people in general that are saying, no, that's not satisfying. I'm not just going to, I'm not satisfied to just say, oh, is this a fact? Is this the way it is? I want to know why it is, and what that fact is actually referring to. So I'm seeing a spiritual, development, I'd say, happening in our culture, and spiritual conversation, and a spiritual openness that I haven't seen for years.
Yeah,
did that make sense? Is that starting to get at the question you're asking?
Yeah, I think it is. Like, we're connecting the dots here. Let's go further with that. So there's a lot of loneliness and a lot of anxiety, in our culture. We hear the stats, we know the stats. And in the pandemic, it's just been pronounced, right? It's what happens in crisis. So if people are truly more open spiritually, what does that mean for them transformationally? Like, is there with the supernatural component that we know about God and about his son Jesus and the resurrection, is there an openness to that supernatural now more? Is that kind of what is leading us to the next piece of this connection of dots that's going on?
I think that there is. As I talk with university students and people in general, what I'm encountering is a openness to what I would call purpose, an openness to a bigger perspective. So, for example, I'm finding less and less people that are atheistic, and I'm finding more and more people, and by that I mean like a staunch, commitment that there is nothing more than just the natural, natural laws, for example. Because when we're talking about natural laws, we're not talking about things like purpose or design. We're just talking about facts again. It's just the way that it is, sort of thing. Where this gets interesting, and to connect these dots further, John, morality, though, when we're talking about morality, we're talking about relationship. We're talking about the way that a relationship ought to be, that there are certain ways that we should or should not treat people. But if that's just a fact of the universe, well, that starts to point to these bigger discussions like, why do you have these moral laws that exist before persons are existing, sort of idea, that start to, again, lead to these bigger spiritual conversations. What I'm finding is, and I'll just give you an example. At my church, we are doing this new thing called questioning God. it's called Questioning Christianity. And so I've been hosting these open forums where people can come and ask questions. And we've got lots of people that will come and ask questions. And what I find fascinating is how many of them are not Christians, but they're coming to church. And I meet these sorts of people all the time. So they're coming because they're looking for something more. They don't buy into this idea any longer that life is meaningless, that there's no purpose or value. They're going, no, I think that there's some things that are right and some things that are wrong. And they're having that, I go, no, I think that there is more potentially going on to this universe. So I see this spirituality as this openness to, why am I here? And what is this all about? And perhaps the profound loneliness and anxiety that many people are experiencing is pushing them to ask those deeper questions, that maybe there's more to all of this than just the profound loneliness that I'm experiencing. And there's this search for community. And this I think is also challenging Christians to rethink what it means to be a Christian. This is something I wrote about in a book that I published with Zondervan called Reclaimed, How Jesus Restores Our Humanity in a Dehumanized World. And I wrote this before the pandemic, John. So just to be clear, before there was even such a thing as COVID-19 to be talked of. And one of the things that I argued is that too many Christians have been taught that they have a personal relationship with God, but have never been taught that they have a communal relationship with God as well. It's both. And that starts to change the way that you see and understand who you are, and that you understand how you understand the world. And now I think through this pandemic, it's made a lot of Christians rethink what it means to be a Christian with regards to, it's more than just my personal relationship, but how do I live in community with other people, and how important that is to who and what I am.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'm seeing that too. This just Generation Z, from what I've read, is really quite open spiritually, and we're seeing that on campuses as well. There's a hunger there, and students are actually, getting saved. They're giving their lives to Jesus. It's like the veil has kind of been pulled back in the pandemic, and we realize that life is vulnerable. Things like the flood in Abbotsford, it flips everybody's lives upside down, and so we're laid bare, like we're exposed emotionally and spiritually, mentally, right, and even physically. So those are some really, really good things, really solid things that you have been talking about. So
I think it comes with challenges, by the way, where I think our technology has not only revealed our vulnerability, but plays into our vulnerability.
Exactly, yeah.
Such that I think a lot of young people should be quite concerned that we've got Mark Zuckerberg, who, suckered us into Facebook and Instagram and living these social media lives where we all feel like crap about ourselves at the end of the day. But now we're being told that, hey, we may not have done that great, and we're in lots of lawsuits that we got to deal with, but trust us, we've got this metaverse, and this is going to be really good, and you're going to have these virtual lives. And it starts to sound a whole lot like WALL-E, if you've seen that cartoon. And at the end of it, right, you got all these fat people floating around on chairs, who are absolutely bored and lonely and whatnot. And I'm like, particularly even as a parent, I'm thinking to myself, do I really want my kid wearing VR goggles all day, laying on a couch, hanging out with his buds on, in some virtual spaceship floating around in zero gravity, thinking this is what life was meant to be like? I think our technology is profoundly challenging us, what it actually means to be human and what we really should be valuing and what it really means to live. That that one gets me fired up, John.
Yeah, well, hey, keep talking about it. I mean, so I love the Wally metaphor there. How far can we just immerse ourselves into mindlessness and have every minute of our day taken up by technology and experiencing something virtually that totally removes us away from this communal thing that you're talking about with God and one another.
Can I just say one more thing on that, just to get students thinking? This won't land with some of them because I know I'm dating myself by referencing movies like The Matrix. But if I'm referencing this movie Matrix and you don't know what it is, go watch it, okay? Because what I find fascinating is that we got the future wrong. Back when we're making movies like The Matrix, right? We think that technology is going to become sentient and that it's going to put us into these little, gooey bubbles in which which our spinal cords tapped into some matrix, right? In which we're living these virtual lives because they're going to try to harness us as batteries. I've just ruined the movie for you if you haven't watched it, by the way. But the part that I find so fascinating, John, is in that version of the future, it's machines putting us into the virtual world. But what we're seeing is the future we're making for ourselves is we're putting ourselves into the virtual world. So fascinating to me that in the Matrix, they're trying to get out of the Matrix because they want to experience the reality of life. But we're doing the exact opposite. We're trying to put ourselves into the Matrix and trying to remove ourselves from the reality of life. I think, again, it raises profound questions that we have to ask ourselves. Why are we doing this?
Well, can you share with us, switching gears here, can you share with us a little bit about your heart of continuing the discipleship journey with university students after they graduate?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm just realizing that's more and more important about apologetics is just helping people to understand even things like their education, and then what it looks like. So, for example, I've walked with a lot of students that have gone through college to get lit degrees or philosophy degrees or bio degrees or whatever, and then they go on to becoming medical students, or they become lawyers or engineers or the like, right? And one of the things that I've noticed throughout that journey is just the need for somebody to walk with you through that and try and help you to understand, your education, and to help you then to understand how do you apply that education, or what it looks like to be a Christian in the different field that perhaps you've chosen. And what I mean by that is this. One is, I think, and this would just be my encouragement to you, university students, sometimes you're going to need a consult. Sometimes you're going to be taking a class in science or lit or whatever, and your prof has a bone to pick. And maybe they've just shown you a very specific slice of literature or the science of certain things to skew your view in a certain way. This is one of the things actually that I would think that I would argue that PhD work has really encouraged me in is reading primary sources instead of reading only these textbooks that are just cookie cutting what they want to show you, because it starts to paint the world in specific ways for you. And so, again, sometimes you just need a consult. You need somebody that you can talk to as you're working through ideas. So that's one aspect, I think, of the work of apologetics and helping work with students. And then when you leave university and you're off into the workforce, starting to realize, what does it look like to apply what I've learned and take on more of a missional mindset, that I don't need to be a missionary in Africa or I don't need to be a pastor in my church to do ministry, that as a Christian that loves God and that loves people, that I can do ministry wherever God puts me. And I would actually argue these days, professional missionaries, if we want to call them that, or professionals that are living out the Christian faith, I think are some of the most effective evangelists and effective ministers that we have right now. And I'd really encourage students to take on that kind of mindset. Is what does it look like to do that? Again, I don't think you're going to be able to do that well, though, without a consult, without help, without people mentoring and walking alongside you in that, in the same way that a missionary would as they're heading off into the mission field abroad. I don't know if that gets at the question you're asking, but that's one of the things that's on my heart and mind right now as I work with students and as I'm encouraging them.
Yeah, and is that taking shape in any greater way in terms of maybe even, pairing up professionals that are going into the marketplace, whether they're accountants or teachers or whatever, with a network of professionals that have gone before them, mentors?
Well, we have kind of two things that we're starting to develop along those lines. One is, and this is just a shameless plug for a leadership summit that we got coming up. And that is, if I think we need to help young leaders network with other young leaders. And so if that's of interest to you, check out apologeticscanada.com. We have a leadership summit that's happening that's seeking to network young leaders with each other. So I think that's an important component. The second, though, component would be there is a need for a Christian network of professionals where we have, and this is something that we've been developing, where, for example, one of the guys that is one of our adjunct speakers and that we've just started working with, his name's Raph. He is an anesthesiologist in Ontario that loves Jesus and that sees his work as a calling. And we need those sorts of individuals, and he has made himself available to engage and encourage other, pre-med students, or those that are heading into medicine, and then doing the same thing with law students and business students and the like. And so that is something that we are actively working on, because I think it's part of the discipleship process that's going to be necessary for the church to be effective moving forward here in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you. And of course, that's a big thing on our hearts in equipping students. It's not just for the 4 years that they're on a campus, but it's after university as well. And so, yeah, I encourage everybody to check out the Apologetics Canada website for this leadership conference and to get all the details there. Well, another thing that I'd like to just ask you, Andy, is there a story that you could share of a life that's been transformed in the work that you do?
Interesting. We have, many stories that we could share. Before I continue on, was there one in particular you were hoping that I was going to share, or is this an open question?
Oh, like a student story would probably be a good one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If there's a university student, maybe.
Okay. Let's see which story would I want to tell. Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of different types of stories, that we could tell, where there are stories of people or students that we work with where they come to faith, stories of people who, of course, recommit their lives to Christ, or stories of people who start to see their calling, or students that we work with. We actually did an interesting video with a friend of mine. Her name is Noi, and this is a student. She was a student in Thailand, where she grew up in a village where she has it's kind of a long story. She has an eye deformity, and she deals with stunted growth. She got made fun of a lot in her village, and she ended up, her mom told her, hey, listen, Noi, if you want to be effective in society, and if you don't want to be made fun of your whole life, her mom said, well, then you need to go to university. You need to get a good education and become wealthy, and then people will respect you. And that was the trajectory that she went on in her life. And she went off to Bangkok to go to university. But while she was there, she became incredibly lonely. And so lonely, in fact, that she was looking for any sort of community. Her aunt comes and visits her and says to her, hey, Noi, I know you're Buddhist, or we're Buddhist. She goes, but I heard that Christians are really friendly. And she goes, maybe you should go and like make some friends at a church. Honestly, this is what her aunt says to her. So Noi's like, well, I don't know any churches, but I know that they put crosses on everything. So she went walking around Bangkok for any buildings with a cross on it. And it just so happened that there was a church on the other side of her campus. Went to church, was welcomed into community. And I think this is such an interesting story for our time, because she went to church looking for human relationship, looking for that connection. And when she came to church, she encountered that, but then she encountered much more than that as she was introduced to God. And this began to change her entire worldview. She began to realize that there was more going on to this world, and her depth of need for relationship was far greater than she understood. She ended up finishing a business degree, but then she used that business degree to do ministry. And she runs a ministry in Thailand now called the Ruth Center. You can check that out, where she serves people with her life and is one of the most dynamic, lovely human beings I know. But she would tell you that's because of Jesus in her life, not because of how great she is. She, in fact, would tell you that before Jesus, she was a very bitter person that really hated people for how much she had been made fun of and for how difficult her life had been, actually. But through Jesus, again, changed her perspective, and she learned to love people. I guess in many ways, that would be my prayer for all of us, that we would see our deep and profound need for not only each other, but for God. And I think for some people it goes the other way. They know their need for God, but they don't realize their need for each other. For her, realizing her need for each other, but not her need for God. And then how God's leading us to love him and to love others in this life. And that ultimately is a part of the work that we do with AC, is helping introduce people to God, helping establish that relationship with God, but also helping people realize their profound need for community and establishing, their roots and foundation in that community as well, both God and people.
Yeah, that is a really cool story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, we made a video about it, actually. You can find it on our YouTube channel. Yeah.
Cool. I have to look that up. Hey, what are a couple of really good books that you would recommend to Christian students?
That's a great question. It's funny, I get asked that quite often, like, what books would you recommend? The first one is the Bible. You may have heard of it. No, but in all seriousness, make sure you're not one of those students that's always reading books but never reading the Bible. So that is both in jest and serious at the same time. But when it comes to recommending books, I find it really challenging to say, here's a book that you should read. And the reason I say that is because it really depends upon what questions you're asking and where you're at in life and what you're looking for. So it becomes a hard question, I find, to answer, with regards to that. I guess one thing though that I would say that for me has been so influential is make sure you're not just reading new books, but you're reading old books. So, read somebody like Augustine, or read somebody like Aquinas, or somebody even like a mystic like Teresa of Avila. She wrote The Interior Castle. Or, you got these other books such as The Imitation of Christ and the like, where there are these old books, but that are so deep and informative of our history as Christians. And I say that because I find that a lot of Christians don't realize how deep and intellectually robust and thoughtful those Christians that have come before us were, and the sorts of questions they were dealing with, and how we have an intellectual tradition that we're a part of, or a story that we're a part of, that I think is important for us to appreciate and to learn from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Because I'm just thinking about a book that I touted. I put on Facebook. Everyone's got to read this, and then went through the book with a group of leaders, and there was a lot of pushback on it. So that's a risky run. So good for you for not naming the book, but but yeah, you really you hit the nail on the head in terms of some of the ancients that we could read from. And I love reading autobiographies of missionaries as well. I get so much out of those, the lives and the hardships and the matters of faith that they had to really deal with. But if I were to recommend an apologetics book, I do like Tim Keller and Reason for God. I just think, that's just one of those key books that maybe students could pick up, because they're short chapters, and he's so articulate. So I don't know any other books along those lines maybe that would fit the student that's interested in digging more into the apologetics.
Well, Keller's a great writer, no doubt. But Reason for God is an interesting book to use as an example, because here, for students, here's a tip. If you want to know good books, then when you find a good book, see who they quote from. Take a look at their bibliography, and you'll find with Reason for God, Keller is relying on other thinkers and scholars like that. Those aren't his ideas, and some chapters he leans more heavy than others to who's influenced him. So I would encourage you to take a look. So for example, if you've got an author that you really like, see who influenced that author. See who Keller's, because Keller quotes from N.T. Wright a lot as an example. So take a look at N.T. Wright or whoever that might be. Now, isn't it interesting, by the way, because if you like music, you'll notice, like, for example, this is how I find good music. I love on iTunes, I'll be listening to a band I like, but then there's that band on iTunes will have who they recommend or who influenced them or who they listen to. And that is one of the ways that I have found great music over the years, is what band do I like and who are they listening to? So you can do the same thing with apologetics books. What do you like and who are they referencing? I will say, again, a shameless plug. I did write a book called Thinking, Answering Life's 5 Biggest Questions. And in it, I've just addressed the big 5 questions that people tend to ask. And I then, in that book, I actually share resources if you want to go deeper on those subjects. So for example, I wrote on like the meaning of life, or does God exist? But then in the back of it, I did this thing where I basically was trying to help people with regards to this. So I said, listen, if you want a light read, here are 3 recommendations. If you want a medium read, here are 3 recommendations. And if you want a hard read or an academic read, here are 3 recommendations. Because that's also part of the challenge here when you're recommending books. Like, I'm going to recommend a completely different book to my mother on apologetics than I'm going to recommend to my friend that's a lawyer, right? It's going to be a different caliber of writing that I'm going to be recommending. And so that's where you've kind of got to figure out where you're at and what you're looking for. So when I say a light read, I'm saying that's going to lean more into story. And then if you want something harder, right, it's going to be leaning more towards logic. I think that's where people like C.S. Lewis are so beloved as apologists in their writing, is he's able to do both. You can read one level of book from him that's very light and easy-ish, such as Chronicles of Narnia or the Screw Tape Letters or something like that. Or you can read something that's very academic, such as, let me just pull this up because now I'm forgetting. Oh, yeah, sorry. The Abolition of Man. So Abolition of Man is very academic.
Yeah. Well, good. Very good, Andy. And it's okay if you plug your own books. We'll put those in the show notes too.
Do you know what's funny though about thinking, and the reason I wrote it is because so often apologetics books are written at a master's level. They're written very academic, and most people don't enjoy reading books like that. So there is a need to take those big ideas and to translate them into very understandable and easily digestible ways.
Right. Well, it's been so awesome to have you on the show today, Andy. And I know we talked a lot about a lot of different things, but just to really encourage all of our listeners to go to apologeticscanada.ca, right?
Yeah, .ca or .com.
Okay, either one will work. And they have lots of resources there, conferences there, and of course they can find you on social media there as well.
Yes.
So I just want to say thank you again, and I'm just going to close this out by thanking all of our listeners today for tuning in, and we hope that what was shared today really helps you in your ministry on your local campuses.